Welcome back to your daily read aloud, The Wild Robot Escapes. We have just started the part of the journey where Bright Bill and Roz are heading home. Okay, now someone tell me what was the first thing they had to do on their journey home? What was the landscape like and what'd they do? Angie?
So they had to run away and then they saw this triangle thing and then she saw 3 other.
Okay. So you are right. They were going through the fields, right, which was tricky because there's not a lot of cover. So she would camouflage like a pile of wheat and lay down flat. And the Rico ship, she did see the Ricos inside there. Why couldn't they figure out where she was? Because they kept flying and passing her. Zoe?
What are the Ricos?
Remember in the first book, those are the 3 robots that came to take her back?
I don't remember that because I wasn't here.
Okay, so the Ricos were the robots that came and said, you're a defective robot, you're our property, we have to take you back to the factory. All right, Hayden.
Her router was taken out.
Yeah, her transmitter, right? So it's gone. So the Ricos and that airship, they can't track her anymore. All right, so they finally got past all the farm country, and then where did they end up? Emma?
They ended up in the woods.
They were in the woods, in the mountains, right? Okay, now we have another situation that just came up. Cadence, what happened? Wolves. Quentin, you want to add to that a little bit?
Yeah, those wolves weren't, like, she kept on jumping, but at some point she lost her balance because the wolves, like, got her foot, and now she's also a little bit more dented also now.
Yes, she is. Okay, so she is up in a tree with Bright Bill, and she is saying, like, wolves, you can't eat me, so leave me be. And they were like, we don't want to eat you, we want revenge. Okay? So, also, what else do we know about the pack of wolves? Something has changed. Angie?
Shadow said this is my pack now. I think he just meant him and Barb.
Yep, it's just him and Barb. So we don't know yet what happened to the rest of the pack. But he doesn't seem very happy. Josiah?
And they what I think happened to them, I think they ran away and, like, didn't think that it was a good mood or something.
Okay, I've got two more comments. Madeline?
I think, kind of the same as Josiah, but when Ross scared them away with the rifle, then the other wolves thought that he wasn't a good leader because they could have got killed, they thought.
Okay.
And so they ran away then.
So they could have left their pack. All right, Hayden, real quick.
I think what happened to the other wolves, or what what Shadow is thinking. I think he's thinking that Roz killed the rest of his pack.
Okay, could be. Dylan?
I think he said, like, one of the Ricos gave him the scar, and he's confusing Ross for
Oh, it could have been a different robot, one that can hurt an animal. Okay, good point. All right, we are ready for chapter 56, page 159 if you're following along. And this is called The Torch. Our friends were stuck in that tree. They sat in the upper branches high above the wolves, trying to calculate an escape. Bright Bill could fly off whenever he liked, but Roz had to come down eventually, and when she did, the wolves would be ready. Shadow and Barb stretched out in the shade. They glanced around and licked their fur and sniffed the mountain air. The wolves looked comfortable, and yet there was tension between them. What's tension? If you feel tension with someone. Hudson?
Tension means, like, you're locked in with them or something, like you have their attention.
That's a really good guess, because tension and attention sound very similar. Noah?
When you're, like, mad at somebody, you have more tension with them.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be anger, but if you have tension, it's like no one's really getting along. Like, you know, if you're sitting with someone and no one's speaking and the air almost feels thick and no one knows what to say, and it's kind of feeling tense, okay? So it's tension. Real fast.
Tension is basically, well, I know Noah just explained it, but this is what my thoughts were when I first heard it. Tension I thought was like when you were, like, nervous about something.
It could be like that, right? So usually you feel tension between people. So the wolves are feeling some tension. I'm hungry, growled Barb. I want to eat rabbits and deer, or maybe go back to farm country and prey on livestock. Anything is better than hunting a creature that can't be eaten. You can eat all the animals you like, said Shadow, after we kill the robot. Barb grumbled with frustration. She didn't understand Shadow's need for revenge, but for now she stayed loyal to her mate. Day turned to night, and the wolves started yawning. Barb's eyelids became heavy. Shadow's body became weary. Then the soothing song of the crickets lulled them both to sleep. The sight of sleeping wolves reminded Roz of those long winter nights on the island, when wild animals crawled into her warm home and slept. She remembered the frightened look in their eyes as they saw fire for the first time. And this gave Roz an idea. Quietly, she broke off a dead branch from the tree trunk. Then she took the lighter from her tool belt and held a flame under the branch's knobby end until it was blazing. And then she dropped down to the ground. Shadow and Barb snapped awake to find the world bathed in orange light. Towering above them, looking like a demon, was the robot. Her eyes were glowing. Her mouth was roaring. In her hand was a torch, flames rippling, embers whirling into the air. The wolves had never seen fire. It was beautiful, and it was terrible. Deep inside, they felt their wolf instincts telling them this ball of swirling light was dangerous. Their instincts told them to run for their lives, and when Roz lunged toward them, they ran. Barb yelped, Shadow whimpered, and the two wolves raced away from the fire just as fast as they could. Chapter 57, The Stones. At first light, Roz nudged Bright Bill awake, and the travelers continued north through the mountains. The goose stood on his mother's shoulder as she marched. His eyes darted around nervously, searching for any sign of the wolves. But the wolves were gone, and our friends turned their attention to a new problem. The weather out there was always changing. Roz and Bright Bill had seen many calm, sunny days suddenly turn to wind or fog or sleet or even snow. Our friends expected bad weather, so they hardly noticed when heavy rain came sweeping down a valley. But there was something odd about this rain. Bright Bill squinted at the oncoming storm and said, "Ma, why is the rain bouncing off the ground?" Bouncing rain? That didn't seem right. The robot's computer brain went to work, and she found the correct word. "That is not rain," she said. "That is hail." Clang! A hailstone bounced off Roz's chest. Another one swooshed into the weeds. Then the sky opened up and hailstones were everywhere. They tore through leaves and branches. They ricocheted off rocks and roots. They flattened flowers and bushes. To the robot, the hailstones were annoying. To the goose, they were deadly. A stone hit Bright Bill's shoulder and he fell to the ground. Roz scooped him up, hunched over, protecting him from the falling stones. But the hailstorm might kill the poor bird if they couldn't find cover soon. Frantically, the robot scanned the area for any type of shelter. And there it was. On the far side of the valley, beside a winding river, was a cabin. It was old and shabby, but it had a roof, and that's what our friends needed most. Roz held her son close, pumped her legs, and thundered across the valley. Heavy hailstones hissed into the grass and squelched into the mud and clanged off our robot. There was a soft thump, and Bright Bill cried out in pain. Roz bounded over the rushing river in a single leap, landed without breaking stride, and kept running. Now she could hear hailstones cracking against the cabin, louder and louder. The robot stomped up to the front door, turned the handle, and stepped inside. All right. We can't make any predictions with our mouth, but we can raise hands. If you think that no one lives in this cabin, raise your hand. Just curious. Okay, a couple of you, like it's abandoned. If you think people do live in the cabin, raise your hand. All right, second question. Do you think it was a wise idea for Roz and Bright Bill to enter the cabin? Who thinks it was a bad idea? All right, friends at home, we're about split. Here we go. Chapter 58 is called The Cabin. The hailstorm was brief but violent. Its icy stones were quickly melting away, but the damage would linger on. The valley was littered with shredded leaves and wildflowers. Wounded animals were hobbling back to their homes. Several unlucky birds lay limp in the grass. Inside the cabin, Roz was standing by the window. She held Bright Bill in her arms, his bruised body wrapped in an old blanket. The robot knew everything there was to know about caring for animals, but all her son needed was time. His injuries would heal on their own. "Go on without me, Ma," said the goose in a weak voice. "I'll catch up to you when I'm feeling better." "That is ridiculous," said the robot. "What kind of mother would just leave her injured son behind?" "But Ma—" "Stop talking," interrupted Roz. "You need rest." Bright Bill tried to argue, but he was already falling asleep. The cabin was simple, just a square room with a wood stove, 2 chairs beside a table, and a couple of cots rotting in the corner. Dusty mugs and bowls sat on shelves. Otherwise, the walls were bare. It was clear no humans had been here for a very long time. However, it seemed that some other creature had moved in. The whole place had a foul odor. That means a bad smell. Lumps of feces were strewn about. So that's animal droppings. And little footprints trailed away from a dark hole in the floor. Roz leaned over the hole, and in the language of the animals, she said, "Hello, is anyone down there?" Something moved, and then a pair of shining eyes looked up from the darkness. "Who are you?" said a voice. "I didn't invite you into my home." All right, 1 second. All right, so, up from the darkness. "Who are you?" said a voice. "I didn't invite you into my home." "I am sorry to intrude," said the robot. "My son and I were only trying to escape the hailstorm." "Your son?" said the voice. "Is that him in your arms? Let me see." Very gently, the robot lifted a fold of cloth and revealed the sleeping goose. "He must take after his father," said the voice. "He is my adopted son," the robot explained. "My name is Roz, and this is Brightbill." The shining eyes blinked, and the voice squeaked with excitement. "You're Roz and Brightbill? The birds have been singing about you for months. You're living legends." "Technically, I am not living," said the robot. "Well, you seem pretty alive to me," said the voice. "Either way, it's nice to meet you. They call me Sprinkles." With that, the creature crawled up through the hole in the floor. She was covered in black fur from her nose all the way to the tip of her fluffy tail. Well, except for those white stripes running down her back. So, you were right, Madeline. You see, Sprinkles was a skunk. The robot took one look at her and stepped backwards. Sprinkles frowned. "You know, Roz, skunks only get stinky when we're nervous." "Are you nervous now?" "Well, sort of, but in a good way. I'm honored to meet you. Please pull up a seat and tell me what brings you here." Sprinkles hopped onto the table and listened as Roz described their journey. The skunk was a very good listener. While Roz spoke, Sprinkles nodded politely and said things like, "Oh my," and "Is that right?" and "You don't say." This went on until Brightbill began to stir. "Ma, I'm thirsty," he whispered. "There's a creek right out back," said Sprinkles, "and those might be useful." She motioned to the bowls on the shelf. "Please, help yourself to anything. My home is your home." It turns out skunks can be quite hospitable. Sprinkles invited the visitors to stay as long as they liked, and so our friend spent Brightbill's recovery in the cabin. The goose mostly slept. The robot brought him water and food. The skunk made sure they both were comfortable. A few mornings later, sunlight streamed in through the windows and onto Brightbill. He was squawking and waddling and fluttering through the cabin. His injuries had healed, and he was eager to continue their journey. "Thank you for everything, Sprinkles." The robot waved as she marched away from the cabin with her son on her shoulder. "Glad I could help," called the skunk. "Misunderstood creatures like us gotta look out for each other." Chapter 59, The Strange Wilderness. Another gloomy day had settled over the mountains. Here and there the sun broke through the clouds, and bright streaks came shining down like spotlights. One of those bright streaks swept over a rugged mountainside and found our friends. For a moment, the robot and the goose basked in the warm sunlight. Then the patch of light moved on and rolled into the next valley, where it sparkled across a strange industrial site. So industrial means like a factory of some sort, or some sort of place where they build things. A patchwork of large boxy structures was nestled among the trees. Broken walkways clung to the walls. Ramps and pipes slanted up from holes in the ground. The robot's computer brain identified the site. It was a deserted coal mine. This was a strange kind of wilderness. Scattered throughout the mountain range were ghosts of human activity. Overgrown railways, rusted automobiles, spindly towers perched on mountaintops, faded signs with messages like "No trespassing" and "No hunting." It seemed humans had once lived and worked in this wilderness, only to leave it all behind. In places, though, there was still activity. Robot activity. Armies of robot workers methodically dug new tunnels and built new dams and worked in new mining operations. They took down abandoned buildings and hauled away truckloads of litter. Our friends were curious about these working robots, but they kept a safe distance and went on their way. Chapter 60, The Hunters. Crack! A gunshot echoed through the mountains. There weren't many hunters willing to trek into that wilderness, but those who did were serious. They camped out, wore camouflage, and fired traditional rifles for the sport of it. Crack! Roz and Brightbill were desperate to stay clear of the hunters. However, that was proving difficult. All right, so I just made a text-to-text connection. Does anyone else remember someone in a book we read that had to hide from hunters?
Sam Gribley.
Sam Gribley. Okay, good. The trees were tightly packed together and the undergrowth was tough and tangled, so they followed the deer paths that cut through this part of the forest. But they never knew when or where the next shot would be fired. Crack! The gunshots were growing louder. Our friends slowed to a crawl, afraid of being seen or heard. And then the chatter of forest animals fell silent. Crack! A bullet whizzed through the undergrowth and a deer went bounding away. At the same time, birds screeched and flapped into the air. Unfortunately, one of those birds was Brightbill. Scared and confused, the young goose fluttered up to a tree limb just as two hunters emerged from the bushes. "What's a goose doing alone in these mountains?" said Hank, staring up at Brightbill. "And what is it doing in a tree?" "There must be something wrong with it," said Miguel. "Maybe you should put it out of its misery." Hank reloaded his rifle. "We're here to hunt deer," he said. "But looks like we're having goose for dinner." Had the hunters known Brightbill the way we do, reader, I'm sure they would have left him alone. But they knew nothing about him. To them, Brightbill was just another goose, a meal, and they were getting hungry. The hunter raised his rifle. He took a deep breath. His finger reached for the trigger. And then a fierce gust of wind suddenly blew across the forest floor. No, not wind, footsteps. Something was stomping toward the hunters. Their rifles were ripped away, bent into hooks, and thrown aside. The men had hunted all manner of beasts, but they'd never come across well, they didn't know what this thing was. It looked like a tree stump, standing on two long roots, with branches hanging from its sides. The men stumbled backward, eyes and mouths opened wide. Then they turned and ran, and their terrified noises trailed off throughout the leaf litter. The goose was terrified too. He slumped off his branch and into his mother's arms. The poor bird was trembling with fear, but he was unharmed. "I am so sorry, Brightbill," said the robot. "I should have acted sooner. You are safe now, I promise." All right, probably our last chapter, chapter 61, The Guide. A light drizzle was falling on the travelers, although they weren't actually traveling at the moment. They were standing still and staring up at a steep mountain of rocks. The robot had plenty of rock climbing experience, but one bad fall out there and she could be stranded forever. So Roz carefully picked her way up the slippery slope while Brightbill fluttered along beside her. They hadn't gone far when there came the sound of hooves clattering on stone, and then a horned creature leaped from the mist and smashed right into the robot. Clang! Roz went flying backwards. Clang! Roz crashed onto the ground. Standing on the rocks above the robot was a wild ram. He had big curling horns and a crazed look in his eye. Brightbill flew to his mother's side, ready to defend her. "Stay away from my mama," he hissed, spreading his wings. But rather than charging, the ram hung his head and started to cry. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he blubbered. "I don't want to hurt anyone. Sometimes I just lose control and smash things. I feel awful about it. Really, I do." Roz brushed herself off. "I believe those are your instincts," she said. "We all have them. They can be very powerful. I only hope your instincts do not end up breaking me." "Don't worry," the ram sniffled. "I'll try not to let my instincts break you." "I appreciate that," said the robot. "My name's Thud," said the ram. "Which way are you headed?" "We are trying to find our way out of these mountains," said Roz, "but they never seem to end." "You're almost there," said Thud. "Let me show you the way. It's the least I can do after smashing you." The ram pranced away and led our friends to a narrow path that wound up the rocky mountainside. Roz tried to stay close, but Thud was born to climb. He easily scrambled up the steep slopes and vanished into the mist. A minute later, his friendly voice called out, "For a creature without hooves, you're not a bad climber." And there he was, peering down from the cliff ledge. The path opened into a foggy meadow where a whole flock of wild sheep were grazing. They reminded Roz of the cows grazing in the pasture, and she wondered how Hilltop Farm was doing without her. Thud pranced through the flock. "These are my new friends," he announced without stopping. "They're lost, so I'm guiding them out of the mountains." The sheep raised their heads. Thud had a habit of making weird friends, but these two were definitely the weirdest. The flock watched as the ram, the robot, and the goose continued up the mountain and disappeared into the mist. Higher and higher they climbed, above the tree line, to where there were only rocks and shrubby plants and trickling mountain streams. They occasionally came upon a dirt road or a hiking trail, and the ram trotted across casually, while our friends crept across cautiously. Why do Roz and Brightville have to be more cautious than Thud? Angie?
Because they're not really good climbers. And what's a ram?
A ram, it's like a bighorn sheep. So the big sheep that live in mountains, they've got big horns, and they'll run at each other and butt heads when they fight. So they just like to kind of do that sort of thing.
Oh, so anyway, they have to be careful because at the beginning of the book, Ross had to climb a lot of rocks.
Okay.
And these are mountains, and mountains can sometimes be steep if you ever had to slip on one, Mrs. Sarah.
Oh, I have. Yes, they can be very tricky to climb. So when they pass a hiking trail, why do they have to be so careful? Noah?
Raycalls. The Raycalls are still flying, and they could see them.
Okay. What about other people? If someone's on a hike, if they saw a robot with a goose following a ram, do you think they might get suspicious?
Yeah.
I probably would. Hayden?
So if I ever saw a goose, a ram, and a robot, I would just freak out and just run. Like, I would ride the ram.
Oh. Well, I'd probably try to take a picture and move along. But we know that in this time period, people think robots should probably belong to someone, right? All right. So, at one point, the ram got that crazed look in his eyes again. His horns came flying at the robot, and she jumped out of the way just in time. Then Thud cried and apologized for his instincts. Roz forgave him, and the group carried on. They finally hiked up from the mist and onto a mountain ridge. Above, the sky was clear. Below, a blanket of puffy clouds spread outward in every direction, so they are up above the clouds. The sun was setting, and the western clouds were burning pink. Roz thought of the mountaintop on her island. If only she could be watching the sunset from that peak instead of this one. But they still had a long, long way to go. Thud pointed our friends to one last path. "This will take you down from the mountains and through the foothills," he said, smiling. The ram suddenly got that crazed look in his eyes again, and the robot prepared to jump. But this time, Thud pulled himself together. He said goodbye to the travelers, and then he pranced away. All right. Actually, I do have time for one more chapter, so really quickly, chapter 62, The Showdown. Daybreak in the foothills, and thick gray fog were everywhere. With such poor visibility, the travelers relied on their other senses. They smelled salty air. They felt sandy soil. They heard seagulls screeching and waves breaking. And then they heard a long, low note from a ship's horn. Somewhere in the distance, hidden by the fog, was the ocean. As if to answer the ship, there came another long, low note. But it wasn't a horn. It was a howl. A wolf was following our friends. Brightville beat his wings and squawked, "Mama, run!" Roz ran downhill deeper into the gloom. Her feet stomped the sandy soil, leaving behind a trail of footprints. There was no time to hide her tracks, so she just kept running. Blurry shapes faded in and out of the fog, and her eyes darted around to see if there were other rocks or bushes or wolves. But the robot should have watched where she was going. She slipped and thumped into sand, and before she could get up, Shadow was on top of her. The wolf was heavy and strong. He pinned Roz to the ground and locked his teeth onto her tool belt. At last, he'd caught his prey. Violently, wildly, he thrashed the robot from side to side. Roz tried to squirm free, but Shadow's grip was tight. There was only one thing to do. She reached down beside the wolf's snarling jaws and fumbled with the buckle, and suddenly she was loose. Shadow staggered backward, the belt dangling in his mouth, as Roz stomped away. Brightville had been circling overhead this whole time, and now he squawked desperate warnings to his mother. "Look out for those rocks! Shadow is gaining on you! There are buildings ahead!" Roz burst through a row of hedges and onto the main street of a seaside village. It was still early, and it was still foggy, and Roz was halfway through the village before anyone saw her. A man had just left for his morning walk when the robot and wolf came galloping down the street. The man decided his walk could wait, and he hurried back inside. Shadow swiped at Roz's heels, but the robot leaped away. She soared over a house and landed on the other side. The wolf dashed around the yard only to see her leaping away once more. This time, Roz landed in shallow water. Waves gently sloshed around her ankles. The robot backed into the ocean, up to her waist, and then automatically stopped. Her survival instincts wouldn't let her go any farther. There's nowhere left to run, Shadow growled as he prowled onto the beach. Either fight or swim. Roz was trapped. Her body lurched forward, then backward as her computer brain struggled to find an escape. And then Brightbill came to her rescue. This way, Mama! Roz didn't hesitate. She launched herself up from the shallows toward her son's voice. Salt water streamed off her body as she soared through the air. Then her feet pounded into the sand beside Brightbill, who was perched atop an old rowboat. By the time Shadow arrived, our friends were rowing away from shore. The wolf's face twisted with rage, and he howled from the water's edge. You made a fool of me, Roz. My pack and my mate have left me. Now I'm just a worthless lone wolf, all because of you. Roz felt sorry for Shadow. She never meant for any of this to happen, but she had her own troubles. The robot's greatest fear was deep water, and now she was paddling through the waves and out to sea. All right, so our next chapter we'll read next time is called The Rowboat, but that is it for today. Thank you all for coming.